really excited. So we're excited now to hear from Ben and Marianne as well. So this session is also going to run an hour, just slightly under, before we go into breakout groups again. And it's geared towards hearing from folks who are kind of linking research and practice, implementing visitor behavior strategies on the ground in public lands contexts. Again, bios are at the end of your agenda, but we're excited to hear from Ben Lahan, who's Education Director at Leave No Trace, and Marianne Bonnell, who's Visitor Services Manager at Jeffco Open Space. The format we're going to take here is kind of just an open kind of discussion format. We'll have Ben and Marianne both start off with just 5-ish minutes of remarks. I don't think either of you have slides, but let us know if I'm wrong about that. We've asked, just as kind of a starting place, for Ben and Marianne to tell us just off the top, what do you think are the most important things for land managers to be thinking about in terms of effective practices and strategies for influencing visitor behavior? So that's the top level question, and we have a bunch of other questions that I'll facilitate towards for the first part of this discussion, and then just start asking your questions either in the comment box or, again, you can raise your hand and we'll weave those in as well. So let's start with Marianne. We'll go to you first, and then Ben. So just opening remarks on what we need to know.
I just wanted to start with, I had the opportunity to work with Tara on urban coyote conflict, and that was probably, I think, 10 years ago that we started working together on that issue, and it has shaped how I look at visitor management and tackling visitor management issues. It's been so informed by Tara's work and Tara's perspective, and so I'm just grateful that I met her earlier in my career and I've been able to apply those things. And I would say that as far as land managers, I know Jeffco Open Space, we're looking at, based on burn rates of toilet paper and things like that we can measure, we're probably up 17 to 20% in visitation because of the COVID-19 crisis. And little cracks that we had in our system are now giant fissures as far as issues that we were dealing with. So it's really brought some of the things that were boiling to just really kind of flipping over the pot. And so figuring out how to tackle visitor behavior and how to really make a difference and have effective messaging is now more important than ever. And how do we focus those resources and how do we do it really well? So I'm excited that we already had in place one of probably the biggest issues, which is just looking at trail courtesy and how do you get people to be nice to each other and respect each other and respect each other's visit on the trail. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I'm thankful and grateful that we are already involved in that research even pre-pandemic. So I'd say that's one of our biggest things, and everything that's wrapped into that burrito as far as how do you get people to respect each other's visit and respect each other's experience on the trail and the wildlife and the plant life around them. So those are my opening remarks. And if you aren't familiar, forget one thing, with Jefferson County Open Space, we have about 48,000 acres. We had an estimated visitation of 7 million visitors to 27 parks. I'm pretty sure that's no longer accurate. So that's what we're dealing with, is lots of people and not very much land. And we're right at the jumping off point for heading to the mountains.
Okay, great, thanks. Marianne, well, thank you for that. We're really excited to dive deeper with you. Ben, just kind of frame up for us who you are and kind of maybe top level how you think about these issues and how you think land managers should think about these issues.
Thanks for the opportunity to be with you all and to present today and share some information with you. I'm Ben Lahan with the Leave No Trace Center for Outdoor Ethics. I've been with Leave No Trace for 19 years and have largely worked on the issues of helping land managers across the spectrum, from federal to state to local, utilize science-based Leave No Trace information to influence the decisions that people make in the outdoors. There's no one silver bullet. I think we have some silver buckshot we can use with a more of a comprehensive approach, but I have yet to land on one singular strategy that can really influence visitor behavior. Through our research, we know that there are ways to influence the decisions people make in the outdoors, and we're going to get into that more today. But one of the strategies I think that we really find tremendously useful is thinking about the full visitor experience, not just when they're on site, but thinking about how we can reach people when they're planning for an outing of any kind, when they're traveling to a location, once they're on site, as they leave and travel home, and then through that reflection phase where you've got social media postings and Instagram and Facebook, and people are sharing their experience in many cases. And so we try to look at this more holistically. I think we get in the trap of trying to reach visitors on site because that's where the majority of the impact occurs. But it's thinking a little more comprehensively about a visitor experience in the outdoors, regardless of whether it's a day hike, a picnic, or an overnight backpacking trip. So the other thing I would add is that we continue to build our partner network. We have about 750 partners nationally. These are corporate entities, outfitter and guide services, small businesses, colleges, other NGOs. And through that network, we are able to really amplify the messages. And even on a local or state level, we see that tremendously beneficial in terms of, again, helping people make good decisions about enjoying the outdoors responsibly. So I'll leave it at there for now, and happy to answer any additional questions.
Okay, great. Well, we've got plenty of questions for you. I want to also mention Ben and Marianne both shared resources that we shared with this full group in advance. There's a great webinar that Ben put together, an hour-long presentation, and we'll be picking certain aspects of that to dig deeper on today. Marianne shared an example of various common messaging that Jeff Coe's using on a variety of issues, from dogs to mud to bears. So check those out after the webinar if you can as well. I want to just stay a little bit at high level for a moment. I think then we'll dig back down into specific tactics. Ben, you talked about the full visitor experience, and Marianne, I think you kind of alluded towards the value of research and information and having strategies in place before things blow up. But can you both just start telling us a little bit more about tactics and strategies that really work and what that looks like? I'm happy to start with either one of you, and feel free to bring in specific examples.
I'll go ahead and start.
Go ahead, Marianne.
I'll go ahead and start. So one of the things that's been really valuable in Jefferson County open space is that in our last master plan, we had a goal of stewardship education. And instead of everybody kind of doing their own thing, we worked in collaboration with our communications team to come up with those 15 or 20 or so common messages that we use across the board: social media, signage, when we're doing media on television or radio or a newspaper, you use those same phrases, you use those same themes. And we learned from, again, a researcher saying, don't do this is not as powerful as do this or show this behavior. And so I think one of the most powerful tools we've had is to really streamline and make our message consistent. Every ranger knows the catchphrase for, mud is a choice or something like that. So we know when we're talking to a visitor about their dog and it's heat and it's summer and we're worried about safety, keep them cool is our message. So it's made it a lot easier. People can just fall back on those simple 5 or 6 words. They're not having to memorize a bunch of stuff or curriculum. It's made it very streamlined and I think very effective because we just fall back on those. And then we've shared those messages more widely, and a lot of the other Front Range providers are using similar messaging and even similar images. So it's starting to create some consistency beyond just Jefferson County open space. So I think that's been really helpful, and we're going to continue to use those into our new master plan period, because we just feel like now we have this really solid foundation, and now we just need to bring those points home even more.
Great. You talked about really 2 things. One, the positive framing of messaging, another about the consistency. Let's focus on consistency for a second. Ben, let me ask you to speak more to that in terms of tactics and strategies for consistent messaging. Does it work? When does it work?
Sure. That's one of the things that I had written down. It's imperative. We see so many parks and protected areas that are arguably come to leave no trace in crisis mode. They are dealing with a variety of issues. And when we start to look across systems, whether it's state, local, federal, oftentimes we'll see some of the areas that have the biggest problems lack that consistency. So when a visitor interfaces with someone in person, they might get one message. They see a sign at a trailhead, they may get a totally different message. They see something online. And one of the things that we try to do is, as was mentioned, streamline that, but also strive for that consistency. The other tactic that we have really been exploring, And I will just say there is a wealth of knowledge out there about crafting effective messages and how that can be done. There's some excellent resources that I'd be happy to share with the conveners, and you all can distribute to this group. But we did a study last year that was a culmination of 3 years of work in 3 different national parks: Grand Tetons, Yosemite, and Denali National Park. And the intent of the study last year was we had been collecting data on park visitors for the previous 2 years, and we wanted to see if data-driven messaging could actually make a difference in terms of visitor behavior with respect to trash and recycling in national parks. And what we found is that when we had good information on visitor attitudes and perceptions about their role in taking care of a place like a national park, we were able to develop very short, succinct messages, less than 14 words. And we saw statistical improvements in behavior in park visitors when the messages were in place versus control conditions. And so it speaks to this idea of there are great ways to craft messages, but the more data you have about your visitors, I would argue the better messages you can create that will resonate with visitors, that will actually cause them to change their behavior in some ways in the moment. And obviously we're striving for longer term behavioral change, but if we can get people to stop and think about the consequences of an action, that's the first step in them actually making more informed decisions about protecting the places where they're recreating.
Great, thanks. Ben, let's stay with you for a moment. In the webinar I mentioned, you do talk about crafting effective messages. You talk about the importance of the why. And just wonder if you could give some examples, and Marianne will ask you for this as well, just of an effective why. You know, what is the message that resonates? So just elaborate in on the most impactful statements and reasons you can give for people to embrace a certain behavior.
So we have, since 2011, been looking at this concept of the why. And intuitively, as educators, I think many of us understand that we've got to tell people why. And you see it elsewhere in the world, not just with respect to the outdoors, but we have done studies in national parks, on Forest Service lands, in the Midwest. We've looked at state parks. And one of the consistent things that we see in our data is that when we can explain to people how recommended practices, leave no trace practices, are effective at minimizing impact, they're more likely to put those practices into action in the future. And so in some ways, it's intuitive, it makes sense. Well, sure, we've got to tell people why, but how does that translate on the ground? And so it's, telling visitors why we're asking them to pick up pet waste. For example, mentioning that pet waste can spread disease, invasive species, can be a water quality issue, and that those are some of the reasons why. Or we have to tell visitors why we're asking you to stick to trails, why we're asking you not to feed wildlife. Just giving them just that little bit of information about the consequences of that action and coupling it with what we want them to do can really make for a powerful message. You could apply that to virtually any situation, but so often we see information that tells people what to do, but it doesn't give them the why they need to do it. And we just feel that, and again, our data show that is a driver of intention, of behavioral intention. It's certainly something to leverage, regardless of the issue that you're trying to tackle. And so I would encourage anyone that's crafting messages to really think about the reasons why it's most important for people to do whatever it is that we're asking them to do, whether it's a parking issue, issues on trails, issues between user types. Those types of things can really be bolstered when we give people the why.
Thanks, Marianne. Do you want to elaborate on that, the effective messages and the why? So you've talked about importance of consistency, but can you give us some examples of messages that seem to have worked really well? Maybe messages that haven't worked, how do you know?
Well, one thing I can be real specific, because we are doing the research directly on trail courtesy. And so we're working with Boulder Open Space and Mountain Parks and Colorado Parks and Wildlife and Corona Insights. And through their baseline data that they collected and then follow-up interviews, we know that very specifically for trail runners, some of the more powerful messages for them for slowing down and communicating are that they want to do that so that they will be perceived as friendly and polite to other visitors. So that's actually an important control for them. They want to be perceived as friendly and polite. They want to create a better experience for hikers on the trail. So these are some things that when we did interviews with visitors, got in their heads and figured out what it is that's what would motivate them to do the right thing. Those are some specific ones for trail runners. When you talk about mountain bikers, again, different visitor group, so different controls on what would make them want to slow down and communicate. And we have here, they don't want to collide with a hiker. They want to protect their access. and they want to stay safe are some of the really important messages for mountain bikers. So slightly different than the running visitor group. So really getting into that market segment and figuring out who it is you're trying to communicate with and what's important to them can have important impact on how you frame your messaging. But the other thing you have to be careful of that we've also learned from this research is if you single out a visitor group, they can get their feelings hurt and they can turn off. And so you have to be careful not to just, because we've done this in Jeffco and we've heard about it on social media, that if you specifically make a sign that, hey, mountain bikers, could you slow down? They all lose it and feel really bad about themselves and feel like they're being singled out. And so you can turn off a visitor group if you just use messaging just for them and not acknowledge that trail courtesy is a responsibility of all visitor groups. So it's been wonderful to really get in here and learn very specifically what some of the motivators are for some of these visitor groups. I'll also use a specific example from, I was on patrol 3 Sundays ago and took some photos of wildflowers like I always do. And I always tweet wildflower pictures and identify them. And I always talk about, let's make sure we let the wildflowers finish their thing and bloom and don't pick them. Well, this time I decided to tie it to, I said, do you love wildflowers? Then pick up dog waste, because dog waste impacts soil quality and recruits non-native species. And actually that tweet was retweeted and liked more than any other wildflower tweet I had done. And I think it was partially connecting it perhaps to that value of, wildflowers and dog waste are connected. If you like wildflowers, you shouldn't be leaving dog waste. So it was an interesting connection for me to see that. So those are some very specific examples.
Yeah, that's great. We can build from there, but I also just want to latch on to the fact that you just referenced social media. Curious, hearing from both of you about the role that social media plays. I mean, we know that Instagram can make instant stars and celebrities out of specific places and areas, which can carry its own impacts, right, for crowding and resources. Can you speak to the role of social media in behavior management?
Yeah, I can start with that one. We, in 2018, there were numerous calls for Leave No Trace to create an 8th principle. There's been 7 principles of Leave No Trace since 1999. And it's not that we are, set in our ways and we can't adapt and change, but what we like to try to do is address issues under that existing framework. And so through a informed process, we created some social media guidance for outdoor enthusiasts, really for anyone who spends time outside. And we released that in 2018. It was very favorably viewed. And we basically said, look, be mindful of what your images portray. Think about including a stewardship message with every post for the outdoors. Think about giving back to the places that you care about. And we also feel like shaming is not the answer. We see so much of that on particularly platforms like Instagram and Twitter, where people just literally get just assaulted, if you will, for post. And so we don't necessarily view that shaming in that fashion leads to long-term behavior change. And so our perspective on it is that social media is like any tool. Where you can do great conservation work with an axe or a saw, but you can really do some real damage too. Social media is no different, right? We can leverage that platform that has so many users to promote responsible enjoyment of the outdoors, to make it look cool, to try to get those influencers on board to where they're actually carrying this message forward to others. And so again, it's a fantastic tool. It's how we utilize it, how people's various feeds are curated, and the types of messages and imaging that we portray. And for most people, I would argue a lot of people just may look at the images, they may not read hashtags or messaging. So being really mindful of what those images demonstrate is really a critical thing. But once again, social media, no one can say what's going to happen within the next 5 to 10 years. We may not have social media as it exists today, but for now, it's certainly a tool that can be utilized and harnessed to help us address all these various issues that we're dealing with.
Thanks, Ben. Marianne?
I would say that social media, the way I frame my patrol is I look for things to take pictures of visitors doing the right thing. So a dog that has the poop bag tagged to the dog. So I can take a picture and say, Frankie packs his own poop out and tweet that. Or, you know, a visitor who's giving a rattlesnake space and really showing that that's what you do when you encounter a rattlesnake on the trail, is give it space and time to move off the trail. You're not interacting with it. You're not trying to get it out of the way. You're not throwing rocks at it. That's the safe thing to do. So I'm always looking when I'm on patrol now for how do I find that positive image that frames that visitor that we love, that's doing the things that we love, that isn't the 4% who can't seem to figure out how to interact with the park appropriately. So that's one thing. And then also, I just think that that amplifies the messages we're wanting to get out. So I go back to those consistent messages Ben mentioned. You know, anytime you have an image, can you tie it to a message? And we really encourage all of our rangers, and all of our rangers have the opportunity to have a social media account. Not all of them do, because that's not their thing, but the ones that do, we remind them, anytime you can tie whatever you're saying to one of our core stewardship messages, you're killing it. That's what we want you to do. So again, it goes back to that consistent messaging and that positive look. Not to say I haven't shamed people. I have taken the dog poop bag pictures. We all have, but I really do try to stick to the positive.
Thanks. And you mentioned that kind of 4%. So one of the questions we had for you, Marianne, based on prior conversations, is just around what have you observed regarding the balance and types of visitors who are compliant and non-compliant? You know, is it really, you know, just a small percentage, and is it on a specific set of issues and behaviors that folks are having a harder time? And Ben, we'll ask the same question to you in a moment.
So it depends on the activity, but for the most part, we really do think, based on a lot of aggregate observational data from our volunteers, our rangers, even looking at our visitation and how many tickets we're writing, that it is a small percentage of our visitors that are doing the wrong thing. So it's that last 4% that aren't leashing their dog or picking up their, because we have an estimated 3 million canine visitors a year, and if everyone were leaving their poop on the trail, it would be horrific. So really, I think most people are doing the right thing. And so it is kind of figuring out how to reach that last 4%. And for a lot of them, they're not a permeable membrane. You just have to write a ticket, you know, but for some people, you can influence behavior either through social norms. So one of the things that we observe as a ranger team is that actually, when a park is not busy, say a snowy day or a rainy day, you get a lot of those visitors that their dog is, you know, 50 feet away from them, and you're contacting them about, hey, did you know we have a leash law? And they're like, well, no one was here, so I thought it was okay. And so some of those things that govern behavior come from having other visitors with eyes on them. So is that social norm of somebody might see me leave the poop bag behind or have my dog off leash, that isn't governing people when the parks aren't busy. And so we struggle with that too, that you know, busy parks sometimes create for better behaved visitors, interestingly enough. So it's an interesting, and again, it depends on the behavior. On a muddy trail, if a lot of people are leaving the trail to walk around the mud, and that those footprints are already there and the trail is already widened, a lot of other people are just going to do that. And so that's why we've gone to just straight up closures rather than trying to get people to do the right thing. We just close the park now. So it does very much depend on the behavior and whether it's possible to get people to change or not, and how we handle that, if that helps a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. Ben, similar question. Are there particular behaviors in Leave No Trace that folks have a harder time with? And what do you see in terms of compliance?
That is an excellent question. You know, we really think of management of visitors usually with two sort of camps. One is direct management. So Marianne mentioned things like trail closures. That can be a very effective tool. Utilizing very direct management activities, closures, gates, hardening of areas, in some cases, permit systems, quotas, timed entry, these sorts of things. The flip side of that is the indirect management. We're trying to reach people with effective information, messaging, interpretation, and so forth. Most visitors prefer that indirect touch, but there are times when that simply won't work, where you do have non-compliant visitors. We have done 2 studies along the Front Range on open space, heavily used open space. One was looking at the use of undesignated trails. And we did a behavioral observation study coupled with paired surveys. So we would observe an individual as they would encounter an undesignated trail junction with a designated trail. If they took the undesignated trail, we would intercept them a little further down that undesignated trail. So we actually saw the decision, what they did at the intersection, and then we were able to ask them about that. And one of the things that was interesting from that study, when we looked at the population of people that was most often using undesignated trails, they all had local zip codes. And so what's interesting is you've got a local citizenry that's familiar with an area, and they know those undesignated trails. And they're going to maybe continue to use those because I've got 30 minutes. I need to get this exercise in, and I know exactly where I can go and how I can pull this off in 30 minutes and be back to my car. People who are less familiar with the system were more likely to stick to the designated trail in most cases. We saw some similar things with a pet waste study that we did when you look at pet waste pickup. And the other one I'll mention is you ask about compliance in terms of different types of user groups. We did a study in Rocky Mountain National Park looking at bouldering and boulders' use of the park. And one of the things that we found is that as recommended leave no trace or minimum impact practices start to impinge on the way that someone wants to spend time in the outdoors, we lose some of the alignment. So it's, I'll practice this to a point, but then if it starts to impact the way I want to spend time outdoors, there may be less alignment with our recommended practices. So though we've looked at that one user group, I would argue that if you looked at mountain bikers or trail runners or equestrian users or even day hikers, I think a similar phenomenon exists where we're good up to a point, but then there starts to potentially be a breakdown. And as was mentioned, I would argue that the vast majority of people are compliant, and those that aren't compliant, I would say the majority of those people simply are uninformed. They're either uninformed, underinformed, or they're just careless. And those types of behaviors can be addressed through effective outreach, education, in some cases even training.
Thanks. I'm going to ask two more questions that we kind of teed up, and then encourage everyone participating today to start writing your questions in chat or be ready with your hand up. One question is about capacity. So, it's great to manage individual behaviors, but when you just have a lot of people, what's the option then, and what have you observed specifically regarding carrying capacity when you're attempting to influence it? So not just attempting to influence individual behaviors, but the overall visitation and impacts in your areas. Marianne, you talked about mud a little bit and just closures. I know you're using lot spot a little bit. Maybe you can speak to that. So let me start with you again.
Well, again, very specifically, when you talk about capacity, one of the things we're doing is this intelligent parking app, LotSpot, where we can, it's not a magic wand, it doesn't make more parking spaces, but it does help visitors make better choices about whether the lot they're planning to go to is already full or not. And even shows visitors a use curve so that if they're thinking, oh, I'm going to go to West Mount Falcon and it's 10 a.m. and it's, no, there's not a parking space for days. They can look at that curve and maybe change their behavior the next weekend and get either ready to launch earlier and arrive earlier, or plan their visit for later in the day so that they're not hitting that high curve where there is no available parking. So that's one sort of capacity issue that we're really trying to help educate our visitors about is can they flatten the curve, to use a COVID term, and not just hit peak visitation. And now our visitors are hearing that message so loud and clear that our curve has gone from 10 to 2 is what we used to say. It is now about 8:30 to 3 is really when now we're telling people, if you want to find a parking space, you need to get there before 8:30 or come after 3. I will say the other thing is that if we can keep visitors on designated trails, that the capacity of the park is, and those trails are not muddy or impaired for some reason, that this idea of how many people are in the park, maybe the lot is full and there's 100 cars parked along the road, but if people are using the trail system, which is a durable, our trails team is amazing. They create very durable, sustainable trails. And if our visitors are staying on those, then the park seems to be able to absorb all of that use. It's really our restrooms and the vault capacity, our ability to keep up with cleaning the restrooms, and our parking capacity that's more impaired than the actual trail experience. As far as those visitors that want some sort of solitude experience, that is impaired by that level of capacity. So again, those folks that want that quiet, I don't want a million people, I don't want it to feel like I'm at the mall, they're going to need to come at a different time if that's their desired visitor experience. So capacity to me is it varies. It's very dependent on the trail conditions and what it can handle, and then also sort of more the infrastructure and how well it is ready to handle all those people.
Thanks, Marianne. Ben, any comments on managing for overall capacity? with respect to visitor use?
The tough part about managing for capacity, at least in my opinion, is that we're dealing with individual but cumulative impacts over time. So it's not the one time somebody steps off the trail, it's when that happens 5,000 times in a season. And so that's where it becomes a challenge, I would argue, because your goalposts are continually moving. Even if you've got great monitoring work, right, and you know what you're measuring against in terms of addressing an issue, as more and more people flock to the outdoors, particularly in COVID, and our latest COVID research shows that that trend is increasing. Um, but dealing with that individual but cumulative impact over time is really challenging. The other thing I'll say is that most visitors, unless they've been spending time in the same place for years, they oftentimes don't see the impact. And so the way that a manager sees the impact on the ground is very different than what a visitor sees. And if a visitor shows up to hike up to the Flatirons in Boulder, and it's the first time they've been there, and man, this is beautiful, and this trail's nice and wide, and I've got plenty of room. If you lived in Boulder 25 years ago, you probably don't even go there anymore. Too many people, too wide, too much infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So that's a challenge. And I'll also say that when we look at the increased use over time, you know, you've got dispersal strategies initially. People can sort of do what they want, right? There's plenty of elbow room, and people have the freedom to go and go where they'd want to go. Then you've got to move into containment. And that holds true for trails, for human waste, for pets, for any number of issues. And then at some point, you step into that management role of saying, okay, how many people is too many people? And while we would argue that an effective Leave No Trace visitor education program can help sort of increase the carrying capacity, if you will. I mean, if we could get everyone to stick to trails, pack out their pet waste, you know, refrain from taking natural objects, picking flowers, and all these various things, we'd be in great shape. But the reality is, it's a constant process of trying to educate so many new visitors to the outdoors. So I think there's certainly a place for capacity limits. It's obviously a tricky decision, and it does limit people's freedom of choice in many ways. But I think there comes a time in some locations for some issues where it may be the only tool that really will solve a problem.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. This group is going to be diving into capacity a lot in coming core topic meetings as well. Just to wrap up my series of questions, you both have mentioned COVID and some of the near-term trends that you're experiencing or observing. I'd like to hear you speak both a little bit more to this, particularly just with an eye and intuition towards the longer-term impacts to attitudes and behaviors, and what that might mean for effective visitor management. Ben, I'll start with you because I know you've been doing some research specifically on it, as you've mentioned.
We have conducted 3 phases of Corona-related research looking at the outdoor recreation community's reaction to the COVID pandemic. And I will say that the sample did come from Leave No Trace, and it's a large sample of our members and people associated with Leave No Trace. So it's largely what we would consider active outdoor enthusiasts. So this is not a nationally representative sample of the US population, but we feel it's a good, strong sample of people who spend time in the outdoors. And so these 3 phases of research, we started on April 9th, and we had a 48-hour survey window. 3 weeks later, we had another 48-hour survey window. And then May 23rd, we wrapped up the 3rd and final survey. And so we had over 2,600 completed surveys. Each phase was a minimum of 800 respondents. And so some of the things that really stuck out to me and our team when we started to analyze the sort of longitudinal data is that recreationists are starting to get back to their normal dosage of nature, if you will. When we pre-pandemic, people indicated they spent as many as 5 days per week on average doing something outside, a hike, a walk, a run, even around neighborhoods, for example. When we ask about how that had changed since the identification of the pandemic, or when the World Health Organization basically said we've got this pandemic, we saw a drop off in that. And in phase 2, we saw a drop off, and in phase 3, we saw a statistically significant rebound with people saying, "I'm now going out more." We're also seeing where people are traveling farther away from home. In phase 1, the majority of our respondents were staying less than 2 miles from home. Now we're seeing that people are starting to venture further and further out. We went from 11% who were only 11% were venturing more than 2 miles in phase 1. Now we've got up to 31% of people are saying, yeah, we're now going further afield. Another thing is people are starting to go into the backcountry more. We're finding that the people are traveling farther from roads than they were earlier in the pandemic. one important thing that we continue to see, and this has been consistent across all three phases, is that people are basing their decisions to recreate on two primary motivations that we found. One is personal health motivations. They want to stay healthy. They want to get outside for mental and physical health. And they also are looking to clear communication from trusted sources. That could be land managers, that could be the CDC, World Health Organization, but they're really weighing this balance of, I want to stay healthy, but I want to look to trusted sources before I venture outside. And the last thing is interesting is recreationists indicate that they are more aware of and indicate there will be longer term changes in their behavior. In phase one, only 38% of our respondents said they felt like there would be any long-term change in their behavior. We get to phase three and 52% of people say, yep, I am changing my behavior. And the most long-term changes that we're seeing are utilizing public lands more often, particularly those that are close to home. And then the last one is really increasing the way people recreate. So people who may previously have done one or two things in the outdoors are now doing 4 or 5 things. So we're seeing not only more local recreation, but different types of recreation. And I think, I don't have a crystal ball, but my assessment is that there will be some people that will fall back into their pre-COVID patterns and other people that will stick with these patterns moving forward in perpetuity.
So it seems like maybe some of the upside is people were listening to the messaging to stay home. But the challenge is the good and bad, right, is that more people are recreating and maybe plan to do so. So that creates those capacity challenges that, Marianne, you started right off the bat with in this discussion around, cracks becoming fissures, pot boiling over. And just curious about your forecast for long-term attitude and behavior shifts and what that means for land managers in managing visitation and behavior.
So one of the things anecdotally that we've talked about as ranger team is we think COVID's helped a little bit with trail courtesy because people don't want to be close to each other. So now they actually have to stop and communicate before they pass each other on the trail and negotiate that space. And so it's been an interesting observation that COVID may actually help us to get those two main messages of, as you're passing someone else on the trail, slow down, communicate, figure out how you're going to negotiate around each other. We hope that lasts. That's actually a real positive thing. People getting upset with each other for not wearing a face covering or not giving enough space, those things are on the rise. I've taken several voicemails of people talking about how mountain bikers are mouth breathers and that they need to be wearing a mask because they're just spreading COVID all over the place because they're mouth breathers. And these sort of things that, again, visitors are putting themselves in this position to be close, and single track trail is by no means 6 feet apart. So people do need to negotiate that within 6 foot pass of each other. So I think, again, thank goodness we were already looking at trail courtesy and we were already thinking about how to be effective communicators at this, because that's really going to help us. I will say that yesterday I spent an hour and a half in a meeting talking about nothing but parking and how do we deal with people that are over parking on roads, and how do we educate people about the fog line and not parking inside the roadway as a hazard. So even basic things like teaching people how to park. These are things we didn't know we had to talk about, but we do. How do you make sure people understand that when they open their car door and their dog comes flying out onto a highway, that that's not safe? So really getting back to some very basic communications of safety and roadway courtesy, things that, again, when you're talking about a trailhead, I didn't know I would be a person who was a spokesperson for the fog line. Like that was not a job I thought I was going to have. So again, we're Jefferson County Open Space. We've actually established a strike team we're calling the Onward Team. Tom Hobie, our director, established this group of people who are really looking at this as our new normal. And how are we going to go forward with this many visitors? And what are the immediate things we need to do to accommodate this number of visitors and do a good job? And so we're really looking at this as it's probably not going to change, that this is us. This is what we're going to be dealing with from now on.
Thanks, Marianne. So lots of challenges / opportunities ahead. I want to go ahead and get questions from everyone else. We've got a little bit of time here. And I know, Steve, you'd been holding your hand up in line. So I'm going to go to you first, and then I see something coming in from Randy, and I'll be tracking everything else that's coming in. So go ahead, everyone, let loose.
Terrific. Fabulous conversation. I would ask both of you, and I don't care who goes first, we have, I think, what is a relatively unique group of 8 land managers at the county, state, and federal level who are coming together with a common vision for this region. Do you have any, given that, is there any particular piece of advice that is the most important piece of advice that you would give us, the most important recommendation you would give us on how we should proceed on this topic in this region? In other words, I mean, how do we take advantage of this collective we've got here that I think is a relatively unique collective?
Thanks, Steve. Biggest piece of advice in taking advantage of the collective. Who's going to jump in, Marianne or Ben?
I'm happy to jump in. I missed the first part of the question, but I think I got the gist of it with the second part of that. I think, at least from my perspective, looking at this, working nationally with all different types of land management entities and other NGOs and so forth, is that really trying to have a comprehensive educational platform for this effort. Because visitors across the Front Range, we know they go to many of the same places. They go different counties, federal lands, state lands, county lands, municipal lands. And I think to the extent that we can have a consistent message to those visitors from one place to the next, it's going to be critical. Because just as an example, if you see Leave No Trace on Jeffco lands, and then you go to Rocky Mountain National Park and it's reinforced there, and then you go to the Arapahoe National Forest and you see it there, then all of a sudden visitors start to realize this applies everywhere, not just in this one place. And so given the scope and the size, this is analogous to a project we've been working on for a year with the Adirondack Park in New York State. It's 6 million acres. And it's a big chunk of land. And they have a very similar challenge where they have very inconsistent messaging from one part of the park to the other. And when you've got something that's this, almost 3 Yellowstones worth of public land, consistency is critical. I see the same thing on the Front Range here in Colorado, is making sure that to the extent possible, and I realize there's locally tailoring that has to occur for specific issues or environments or activities or populations, but to the extent that you can use this collective to have almost this singular voice promoting outdoor ethics and responsible enjoyment of the outdoors, in my opinion, that's going to be one of the greatest strengths.
And I will agree with that consistent messaging is huge. And again, with this joint trail courtesy study, one of the most powerful things I've learned is that we weren't even all on the same page as how to identify and define and what to look for and measure toward trail courtesy. That was an entire meeting and a lot of discussion about how do you narrow trail courtesy down into a couple measurable things that you can look at and define and measure in the field so that you could do research on it. So that was, and then looking at our regulations that were, depending on which jurisdiction you're in, visitors are getting different messages about what they can and can't do. And so I think having inconsistent regulations also, because I always tell our visitors, our regulations are always based on safety and protecting resources. And so having various regulations is confusing to the visitor. I can't tell you the number of times I've talked to somebody with their dog off leash and they say, wasn't this Boulder? And I'm like, nope, you're not in Boulder, so your dog needs to be on a leash. So it's just that inconsistency. We're not doing ourselves any favors when we don't have consistent rules. And again, those rules, I'm not just talking about rules, I'm talking about the rules are there to protect resources and safety. And so making sure those are consistent. So visitors are set up for success for understanding what their interaction with the outdoors is going to look like, no matter where they land.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Randy, you had a comment, just I think it was more of a comment than a question, but just around trail courtesy, maybe is affecting foot traffic more so than other user groups and behaviors. Are there any differences you're seeing, Ben and Marianne, in the effects of COVID and social distancing on different kinds of user groups? Are people responding differently based on their activity?
I will say he's correct that the main impact has been on foot traffic. One of the things I forgot to mention that we also greatly appreciate about COVID and some of the things it has brought is limiting group size. So one of the big challenges we have is that when you have a crowded trail system and then you have somebody who wants to do a fondue hike for 40 people, it's insane. That doesn't work. That's not a proper use for a single track trail, and it kind of ruins everyone else's night. Or when you have a bunch of people who've met and had beers, and then they want to go have 22 riders hit North Table Mountain. And so a hiker encounters 22 cyclists coming at them, you know, in a big bolus. That is not something that is conducive to a good visitor experience. So what's been great about COVID and the limitations of group size is that when we had this, people can't congregate in groups more than 4, that actually works great for single track trail. And we would love to continue that, just that message to visitors that if you're using single track, don't be doing these big groups. It's not appropriate for the trail. It's not an appropriate experience for everyone else. So to his point, yes, absolutely, social distancing is not working for all activities, but what we have seen is with some of these groups that tend to form these big social groups like mountain bikes, we're not seeing those big groups because they simply can't right now. And we'd love for that behavior to continue.
Thanks. Amy Saxton, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you. The one takeaway I had from all of the speakers today is just realizing the positive impact that coordinated and consistent messaging can have. And for us as the NoCo group, it occurs to me that that might be something that we could try to launch sooner than later, rather than waiting 12 months to the end of this process of learning about all of this, that it could be something we do sooner. Also, you know, the impact takes time. All of those reasons might mean that we have an opportunity to make some changes to the scope and scale of the problems we're all having sooner than later. So that's really a comment, not a question, but that's what I'm thinking right now.
No problem. Looking for other hands and chats.
I got a question from Matt. Just it came in privately, but I'm happy to address that.
Yeah, go for that.
So the question was, how does Leave No Trace, how do we come up with our messaging? What goes into that? We have a system that's been in place since we've been in existence, 25 years, where we have a peer review body of scientists, of practitioners, of outdoor enthusiasts, people that really are knowledgeable about specific issues. So we couple that with the best available research. We get various interest groups to participate, whether it's mountain bikers or climbers or hikers, equestrian users, what have you. And then we work through this process of ensuring that our information is solid, it's science-based, and that it is applicable across the land management spectrum, from federal to state to local municipal. And again, we know that things have to be locally tailored, but we don't just create these things in a vacuum. We have advisors from various agencies around the country who participate in this process. So we do our best to respond not only in a timely manner, but also in a very comprehensive way so that we're providing the best information possible. And that's something that we revisit often to make sure that the practices we're recommending are still based in the best available science, so that we are not only being effective in our outreach efforts, but the practices we're recommending are having the desired effect on the ground in terms of either minimizing impact or at least not creating additional impact.
This is Matt. I want to pile on here. I used to be on that educational review committee. I had a working knowledge working at City of Boulder Open Space and Mountain Parks on recreation ecology and behavior change research. And I just think I've heard conversations through the last year and a half I've been on commissioner about, well, we got to get together on messaging. Well, it's been done. We should just, like Amy said earlier, we should just start doing it. It's there. And there's a front country program, which I had a hand in starting, I don't know how many years ago that is now, Ben's predecessor, but it's there and we should start that now.
1996, Matt, was when we adapted the 7 Leave No Trace principles to be more front country in nature. We've even gone more into the urban space. When you look at recreational participation, about 85 to 90% of outdoor enthusiasts recreate in what we'd consider front country, areas that are close to home, easy to get to by a vehicle, predominantly visited by day users. And so the vast majority of our focus these days is on that huge chunk of people spending time in the outdoors. So it's more relevant, it's less science-y, if you will. We still give that why, but it's more approachable for those casual front country visitors that are just really out for the day in most cases.
White tennis shoe crew.
Thanks, Ben and Matt. Alex, you had messaged me, you have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Ben and Marianne, for the awesome presentations. And kind of reflecting on COVID, and you guys both spoke to changes that COVID have shifted behaviors by some recreationists that are in line with kind of the same message we've been saying all along. Like I saw messaging that if a trailhead was full, keep going. Like that's always the case. But for some reason, people are responding a little bit more to that now. So I'm curious, both so heavy on the messaging side, going forward, do you guys foresee yourself kind of transitioning and telling the public, like, actually, these behaviors are always what we've been doing? Or like, I know people are doing things now because of COVID. Do you transition back into like trying to make that the new norm, and just kind of looking forward into the things that have changed that have always been the case, but people are responding different now?
Well, again, I'll go back to my hopeful, tragic optimism that group size will remain small. I think that is if you think about impacts on single track and parking and these large groups showing up expecting 20 parking spaces and just clogging trails, I would really love to see that group size stays small. And that's something we've been preaching all along, but COVID has forced that issue. And if people could just realize that hanging out with 4 people is much better than 30 on the trail, that would be a blessing. The other thing that I think we've struggled with balancing events. We're getting so many requests now for events and races and runs, and everybody's got the best intentions. It's it's for a nonprofit and all that. And again, it's this idea of that's just hard on the system. You're asking 200 people to come and do a run on a Saturday, and it's like, well, how are you going to fit them in there when you have the existing visitation? COVID got rid of those events for a while. Now they're starting to come back, and we're trying to figure out how can we kind of keep this new normal of making those sparser than we used to in the past, because it's just for so many reasons it doesn't make sense when you're talking about already parks that are already bursting at the seams. So those are my 2 comments.
Ben, did you want to pile on at all on that one?
Yeah, I would just add that I do think some of these behaviors may be here to stay, which is a good thing. And we have not yet quite shifted messaging from, hey, do this because of COVID, now do this all the time. But we're seeing that shift. So an example of that is I have heard from numerous land managers around the country about one very specific issue, and that is the closure of toilet facilities in many locations. And so what we've been encouraging visitors to do is show up prepared. Bring your own toilet paper, bring your own hand sanitizer. They may be open, they may not be stocked. And so it falls right in line with the first principle of Leave No Trace, which is plan ahead and prepare. And so it just further it's a way for us to capitalize on the momentum right now to promote these messages we've always been promoting. Because what I think the risk we might run if we're not careful is that people will think, oh, that's just a COVID thing. So if we can move beyond this, the whole world, and move beyond this pandemic, what we don't want is messages that people are able to compartmentalize. Oh, we only need to do that at a certain time. Because what we'd like to do is to say, this is what we've always been saying. It's really important now, but just we want you to continue these behaviors. So there are ways to capitalize on this, I would argue, because we have seen a change in behavior, and that the fact that we can reinforce that in a very positive way, I think could have a long-term beneficial impact to public lands.
Thanks, Ben. Randy, you had your hand up, but you put it back down. I just wanted to check in. Did you have a question still?
Well, I was just thinking about all of this is kind of running around. We talk about norms, and that leads me to normalization. And each new, 5-year immigrant group, or whatever you want to call it, that comes into the area, comes in and sees something that becomes a new baseline. And I think it's on your right side, if you can see my picture, that ridge right there. I was walking with Stuart Udall 44 years ago, talking about putting in the Continental Divide Trail and scouting the path. And at the time he said, if we build all of this and put this signage and put this nice path in, won't it reduce bushwhack trails? And at the time I said, I don't think that that's true. And I still agree with that, except only it will work, but it takes a holistic approach to the whole thing. Because I said, we're sitting in this area, these 4 14,000-foot peaks that are right here, right on top of a really large metro area, which I thought was really large back then. And now we've got 3 to 4 million people and growing very rapidly. And so I think that's the reason I asked the question earlier about what are the most effective triage things we can do. And I totally believe in education and how we craft our messages and all of those things. But that's why I ask, it's happening so quickly, and COVID is just like a glimpse of the future, this telescope into the future right now at this moment. And it seems like we have to do the most effective triage behavior triage, I think I call it, which is why it seems like it's the size of infrastructure and enforcement around that infrastructure, as well as maintaining that infrastructure so that we leave the example so that people will behave better because they're looking at infrastructure that's in good place. But we built a lot of things and it didn't really affect behavior. We just get 1,000 people on the mountain in a day now, and it doesn't really, and instead of, when we build a park, if we see 200 cars and build a parking lot for 200 cars, we end up with a parking lot full and another 800 cars all the way to the highway for 2 miles. So it seems like it's got to be infrastructure and regulation along with as the most effective tools because of the immediacy of the problem that's coming at us so fast. Can you speak to that? The fact that we're sitting on top of 3 to 4 million people and most of the Arapahoe National Forest is within an hour of that 3 to 4 million people.
So speaking to, so I think the question is, how do you triage? I think also, Randy, I'm going to add a little dimension to this because it may be our final question here. How do you triage and how do you react given the pace of change? Folks have talked a lot about evidence and data-driven, management and strategies, but Randy's speaking to what can you do now? And and I think it begs the question of how much do you need to know in order to really go ahead and act? And I want to open up to Ben and Marianne, and I might also actually just pitch it. Tara, I think, is still with us. I think we lost Amanda, but would love, to have you also reflect on that as our kind of final question. How do you triage? What information do you do? How do you keep pace with all these rapid changes?
I mean, the land managers that we work with, particularly through our consulting services, we try to help them take a holistic look at the issues they're dealing with. There are some issues that are stop and fix now. There are some that are, near term, and there are some that, yes, it's an issue, but we can't tackle everything right now. And so I tend to see managers get in a sort of this vicious cycle where they see an impact and they try to deal with that right then and there on the spot because it's just so glaring. But taking that holistic look and saying, okay, what are the biggest issues? Is it people creating impacts on the Continental Divide Trail, or is it impacts we see at the most heavily visited sites in Jeffco, and what needs to happen first? The other thing to keep in mind is that when we look at the behaviors of visitors that create issues, there are unavoidable impacts. There are things that are illegal that people do that create impacts. And then I mentioned earlier, you've got people that just act in careless ways, people who are uninformed, or people who are unskilled. And what we try to do in our approach is we realize we can't educate people out of, if they're lawbreakers, it's hard to educate them out of breaking the law. If it's an unavoidable impact, that's a tough one to educate people out of. Where we really try to focus our efforts, and this really is tries to help us be judicious with our resources, is focus on the careless, the unskilled, and the uninformed. We feel like we can make the biggest difference in that group. And so taking that comprehensive look at all the issues, in this case along the Front Range, and starting to develop a format or some kind of a database, if you will, of the most pressing things and starting to chip away at those. I know that sounds obvious, but I find that there's just so many things going on with increased visitation. Those goalposts keep moving. Dealing with that individual but cumulative impact is really challenging, and just trying to take a step back, be thoughtful about the approach, and really start to deal with those key significant issues first, and then work your way through the process has served a lot of our land management partners well.
Thanks, Ben. Marianne or Tara?
I'll agree with Ben, and then I'll just add too that at Jeffco, for sure, what we've done is really look at our work core and say, who has ranger experience and can we get them out in the field? So we had a couple people that weren't rangers that we just said, your job is now a ranger. You're going to uniform up and you're going to come out and join us, because we were just we needed help that badly. And that goes back to one of the things that I think is super important, is having people out there talking to people one-on-one. And I have this whole arc of my education career, and I think I've come to this point where I think one of the most valuable things you can do is have that informal, roving, interpretive contact with someone on the trail. Hey, thanks for having your dog on a leash. Hey, did you know it's pretty hot today? Do you have water for your dog? I've got this bowl. Do you want this? You can have it on the trail. So that one-on-one conversation that may only last 10 seconds, but it's so much more valuable to meet the visitor there, and you can't do that without the people out there to do it. And so if you're sitting back waiting for people to come to you at a facility or attend programs or whatever, we're really looking at you've got to get people out there and talking to the visitor. And like Ben said, they're unskilled, maybe they're uninformed, and just saying to people, hey, are you familiar with this white line? This is called the fog line, and your rear view mirror is in the roadway. Can you repark your car for me so that you're safe? And that's more valuable than just saying, we've got this huge parking problem and we're not going to do anything about it. You know, we're just going to sit and wait. So I think that value of getting out there and talking to visitors and figuring out what's in their head, like that response of, I didn't think my dog needed to be on a leash because no one's in the park today. And I'm like, well, nature's someone. So let's talk about that someone that you can't see, that it really does matter that your dog's on a leash. So those are some things that I think at least you feel like you're doing something. And that's where I want to make sure that instead of waiting, we're actually acting. And we may learn a lot by acting. We may learn that what we did was wrong, but at least we're trying to do something. So that would be my other message.
Thanks, Marianne. Tara, I'd offer to you just piling on to here this question of data and how much do you need to know and when do you act? Just any final thoughts on that too?
Yeah, sure. To piggyback on what Ben said, I think, taking this more holistic, or as I talked about, like a systems level approach to understanding these issues, and then try to pinpoint what is having the most impact. In the community-based social marketing realm, which I briefly touched on, they emphasize, targeting that behavior that has the most detrimental impact that you want to affect. And so recognizing that things are constantly changing, you can't affect everything and you can't address all behaviors. And I think another important consideration in this is just, recognizing that on the ground, there are going to be a lot of times where you just can't do much about what's actually happening, but you can take that step back and say, well, what do I want to try to affect and is having the most impact? So I just think that systems approach is absolutely critical.
Thanks, Tara. Steve, you had pinged me just for a final comment.
Yeah, actually, I was, and then I pinged you saying, never mind, let's go to the breakouts. But as long as I've got the floor, let me just say, to the extent that we've got behaviors that are happening in COVID that we want to see continue going forward, I think there's some parallels and some lessons learned to be learned from the 02-03 drought, when people automatically just went right to good behaviors about conservation. But when the drought ended, there was a lot of uncertainty. What are we supposed to do now? And so that is when Denver Water, for example, developed a messaging campaign that had as its fundamental purpose reinforcing those good behaviors that happened in the drought, getting people to understand, yes, you should do those during a drought, but you should really do those behaviors all the time. And it led to the Use Only What You Need campaign that was so wildly successful for Denver. So my point is, if there are behaviors that we want to see continue, to make sure they continue, that will require an intentional effort, I think, and some education to consumers or to the public so they understand that, because otherwise, once the pandemic goes away, I think there'll be a big question mark in people's minds. What do we do now? So anyway, that's just a lesson learned from the past, and I didn't mean to take that much time with that.